in disagreement for years. Tensions escalated sharply earlier this year. Both presidents accused each other of sabotage. Kigali accused Uganda of aiding armed elements that seek to destabilize Rwanda. In March, Rwanda closed its border with Uganda, halting trade and issuing a travel advisory. Rwanda ordered its nationals not to travel to Uganda and barred imports of Ugandan goods. In August, Rwandan President Paul Kagame and Ugandan President Yoweri Museveni signed a deal to try to mend ties, vowing to respect each other's sovereignty and refrain from actions that destabilize each other's territories. Well, Uganda says it is still committed to restoring relations with neighboring Rwanda, despite the killing of its two nationals there. Here is Uganda's Foreign Affairs Minister, Henry Okello, in an earlier telephone interview.
Honorable, if I may ask, what is your comment on the continued violence between Uganda and Rwanda, especially at the border crossing?
It is very unfortunate that two Ugandans were killed recently by Rwandese forces in unclear circumstances. We think that it's not necessary at this stage for force to be used against citizens who cross sisterly countries on the border, unless, of course, unless it's absolutely necessary to use such force. So we're glad that there's an investigation taking place by Rwandese authorities to come to ascertain what took place, and we hope that if it's found that they were unlawfully killed, then the Rwandese authorities will take measures to discipline those officers who committed the crime.
Honorable, finally from me, yesterday we saw the government spokesperson Ofono Pondo issue a protest letter that was from the Minister of Foreign Affairs. What was this protest letter about?
Well, the letter was issued by my permanent secretary to protest the killing of the two Ugandans who had crossed the border and were killed by Rwandese forces. That was the essence of the protest letter. I would like to inform you that we in Uganda are determined and have the will and the courage to ensure that the dialogue continues with Rwanda in order for us to address and find lasting solutions between our two countries and to reinstate the relationship that we had before the commencement of this conflict. We have the will and determination, and we look forward to engaging our brothers on this matter as soon as possible.
Thank you very much, Honorable.
Thank you.
For more analysis on the situation, we're now joined by Dismas Nkunda, who is a political analyst. He's a longtime leader in Ugandan civil society and the founder and executive director of Atrocities Watch Africa. Thank you so much for joining us. Just tell us, what do you make of the ongoing accusations and counter-accusations between these two countries?
It's something that has not happened in the recent past. It's a bit unfortunate, and in particular, one would have hoped that it's a matter that could have been resolved by use of the regional mechanisms such as the East African Community. To find that Rwanda and Uganda, who are the cornerstone members of the East African Community, are at loggerheads and conflicting is certainly one of the biggest blemish that we have in the region. Given that they have historical and geographical relations, historical relations because Uganda was home to many of the current Rwandese government officers and civil servants before they launched their war in 1994. So to that extent, it's a pity that the two countries can be at loggerheads at this time given that they have a past that should have held them together for long.
Mr. Nkunda, given the complex relationship between President Kagame and President Museveni and the recent developments, what, in your opinion, are the prospects of the August agreement?
First of all, in my view, the August agreement, first of all, an agreement between President Yoweri Museveni and President Kagame did not need to be taken to Angola for negotiations. These are two gentlemen who have known each other for a long period of time. They served in the same army. They were in the bush together. They served in the same government. I am sure that they are certainly a phone call away from each other. They have relations in terms of their customary relations, one giving another cows, as it has always been in their cultural understanding. So for them to go to Angola for negotiation between them to have peace was certainly not one of the most important, the best things that they should have done. I'm sure that they are just simply a phone call away to be able to discuss and resolve this matter. It's not the first time they have done it. They have had conflicts before, and they have sat between themselves, and they have been able to resolve this matter, and I do believe that they can still do it.
Mr. Nkunda, in September, foreign ministers from both countries agreed to meet after 30 days, and that was in order to negotiate opening the border, which we're hearing is still shut. But the meeting is yet to take place. What's been the impact of this on both sides, especially for the small traders along the borders?
The biggest, the people who have suffered most certainly are the small businesses. Rwanda, the border between Rwanda and Uganda is one of the, people have relations across the borders. So movement between the two countries on the borders between Uganda and Rwanda, particularly the one of Katuna and the one of Bunagana, the one of Chanika, has always been one of the easiest, in which people can farm across the border and others can farm across the border. They intermarry, they trade in very basic commodities that people can use as consumables at home. So the closure of the border, and in particular that it's Rwanda which has closed the border. So Uganda says for them they haven't closed the border. They still accept Rwandese to come to Uganda. But the recent escalation, in particular the killing of the two individuals who had smuggled goods across the border, it's an indication that things are not that well, and the biggest damage is going to happen to the local, particularly women groups that trade in very basic things such as potatoes and beans. So those are the ones which are going to suffer most. And it has increased the level of smuggling, which had ceased on the border between the two countries, and now it has taken center stage again.
Thank you so much for joining us, Mr. Nkunda. Mr. Dismas Nkunda, a political analyst. He's also a longtime leader in Ugandan civil society and the founder and executive director of Atrocities Watch Africa. Well, we're moving on to day 2 of the Paris Peace Forum, where 27 heads of state and the government have gathered. The meeting was set up by French President Emmanuel Macron to find multilateral solutions to ensure peace and stability around the world. CGTN's correspondent Natalie Powell reports.
Business leaders and NGOs are in Paris calling for collective action for world peace. High-profile participants like China's vice president and the president of the DRC want to see closer global cooperation on dealing with destabilizing issues.
To preserve peace, we need to engage in debate and share with one another the solutions generated and experienced by each of us. By doing so, it then is possible to have a common agenda, integrating a number of common values, and make sure man and the planet are at the forefront of our efforts.
80 debating sessions are taking place, and 114 global governance projects will be pitched over the course of the forum, covering topics such as inequality, climate change, and preventing extremism. While companies involved in initiatives like e-waste recycling hope to promote business and form partnerships.
That is obviously a great window for communication, because here we have access to very high-level people to talk to, and then we can get the political interest that this topic deserves. Second thing is that this project has global aims. Basically, we're trying to set up an activity which could be replicable in about 100+ countries. So right now we're looking for interested representatives to be able to work together and try to set up the context to be able to implement the first replications of the project in the next few years.
And with COP15, the Convention on Biological Diversity taking place in China next year, the growing cooperation between Paris and Beijing on tackling climate change and developing biodiversity is also being discussed here.
China and France are trying very hard to raise the multilateralism and both to cooperate in the environmental field and the other field, of course, together, and trying to make COP15 the next COP for Biodiversity Convention on the highest agenda possible.
Now in its second year, the Paris Peace Forum aims to overcome risks faced across the globe. President Emmanuel Macron has spoken many times of how peace cannot be taken for granted. But with the constantly evolving landscape of technology, trade, climate change and economy, to name just a few, there are major concerns that these issues could well spark conflict. But the French president hopes that establishing a common responsibility to finding solutions here in Paris will go some of the way to tackling these major global issues. Natalie Powell, CGTN, Paris.
Leaders from the Sahel region have held a panel calling on the international community to back the region's G5 forces. The leaders who met on the sidelines of the Paris Peace Forum reiterated that the joint force could not operate without global support. The G5 was created in 2014 to strengthen development and security links between the 5 G5 countries, but has struggled with funding since its foundation. The group has become increasingly prominent in international peacekeeping efforts due to a jihadist threat in West Africa. Just last month, African leaders pledged $1 billion to fight terrorism. Currently, France has deployed over 4,000 troops to the region, and there exists a 16,000-strong United Nations peacekeeping mission in Mali.
The question that we ask, why are the joint forces of the G5 of the Sahel not yet operational? What can we do to make these G5 forces operational? With what means? All the more so when other forces are better equipped than our armies. There you see the difference.
In the Sahel, we've put in place a joint force, the G5 Sahel, with contingents in 5 countries. That is Mauritania, Mali, Burkina Faso, Niger, and Chad. We've combined our abilities. We've launched an appeal to the international community to support these different joint forces which fight for peace and security, not just its own security, but for the world's security.
Saying with security matters, at least 5 civilians have been killed in a suspected attack by the Allied Democratic Forces in the Democratic Republic of Congo. The assault took place near a UN base in Maimoya in the east of the country. Residents in the area have raised concern over the non-intervention of either the UN or the DRC's armed forces. The ADF rebels have been operating along the Congo-Uganda border and remain active in eastern DRC. This latest attacks comes not long after the government launched an operation to wipe out armed groups and rebel forces.
Images may appear to be identical, but looks can be deceiving. The difference is not always obvious. It has to be discovered. There are always different sides to a story. We put the focus on the details. To see more, to understand better. CGTN. See the difference.
Well, Chinese President Xi Jinping has arrived in the Brazilian capital Brasilia for the BRICS summit. The president and his wife, Peng Liyuan, were welcomed by Brazilian officials. This year's BRICS meeting is taking place on Wednesday and Thursday. Leaders of the emerging market bloc, Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa, will focus on cooperation in technology, the digital economy, and the fight against transnational crime. Well, at the BRICS summit in Brasilia, the participating nations are expected to reaffirm support for multilateralism. CGTN's Paulo Cabral spoke to their representatives about where the bloc is headed.
The last time a BRICS summit happened in Brazil in 2014, the launch of the group's new development bank was a highlight of the meeting. Since then, the 5 nations developed different mechanisms for political cooperation, trade and investment. Now their leaders gather again to discuss new projects and contemporary challenges. This year's declaration is being drafted.
So we are going to make some comments about strengthening and reforming multilateralism. It includes the UN, the IMF, the Security Council, the WTO. We are also going to make comments about our economic and financial cooperation in several areas.
When BRICS leaders meet here in Itamaraty Palace, the headquarters of Brazil's Ministry of Foreign Affairs, they will have to discuss the future of BRICS as a multilateral bloc at a time of rising nationalism and protectionism around the world.
The ambassador of South Africa in Brasilia says his country is well aware of the importance of working with international partners.
South Africa of today comes from a history of working with the whole world. We are the best beneficiaries of the world working together, because were it not for solidarity from throughout the world, South Africa would still not be a free and democratic society. We want to make sure that South Africa is known as a reliable partner.
For the Minister Councillor in the Chinese Embassy in Brazil, a unified approach to multilateralism is essential.
We, BRICS countries, we are going to send out a strong message to the international community that we are defending strongly the multilateral system, a more open, free, fair international trade system. So I think that will be a very strong message this summit will deliver to the international community.
In this conference in São Paulo, ahead of the summit, representatives from nations also discussed the present and the future of the bloc.
There is great potential in this grouping to contribute to the reform of global bodies on the political side, like UN Security Council. It needs to reflect the current global order.
These 5 nations respond for 27% of the global GDP, 40% of the population, and their combined territory represents 26% of world's land surface.
During the summit, nations will have much to discuss, yet it remains to be seen how successful these countries will be in working together to push forward their common agenda in the international arena. Paulo Cabral, CGTN, Brasília.
South African President Cyril Ramaphosa will lead a delegation to the 11th BRICS summit in Brazil. The BRICS grouping has become an important geopolitical and development mechanism for the 5 nations. For more on this, we're now joined by Dr. Emmanuel Matambo, postdoctoral research fellow at the University of KwaZulu-Natal in South Africa. Thank you so much for joining us, Doctor. As the leaders embark on the BRICS summit, what should they be prioritizing, in particular South Africa, which is the only African country in the bloc?
As a bloc, thank you very much, first of all, for inviting me for this interview as well. As a bloc, the BRICS countries are actually under very awkward circumstances right now because of the ultra-nationalism seeping into Indian politics and Brazilian politics as well. But then economically, of course, the bloc has a lot of potential. I mean, having a share of about more than 25% of the global GDP and 40% of the population. But they need to pull together and make sure that they keep Brazil in the BRICS, because Brazil has been more or less going off on a tangent, especially during the build-up to President Bolsonaro's election last year. With South Africa as the only BRICS member there, South Africa will probably have to look more at its effort, its economic growth as the only South African member, because its growth has been very sluggish. And then at a continental level, it will also have to make sure that it carries the African flag on it.
Would you say that the continent as a whole has benefited from BRICS cooperation? And if so, how has it benefited? Well, we seem to have lost our guest there. We'll try and get him back. But for now, let's take a look at news that's going to be coming up after the break. Delegates gather in Nairobi to discuss population and development in the continent. And we take a special tour of the Eritrean capital, Asmara, a UNESCO-registered World Heritage City.
Each day, there are millions of stories. Each one can open new perspectives, new possibilities. Wherever you look, we are there to see, discover, explore. We put the pieces together to find what really matters to you, all around the world, all around the clock. Our reporters are at home across the globe. From our headquarters in Beijing and production centers in Washington, Nairobi, and London, China Global Television Network. Stories from across the globe, reaching people across the globe. CGTN. See the difference.
Welcome back. You're watching Africa Live. Well, Tuesday should have been the day South Sudan attained a new power-sharing government. This was, however, pushed back 100 days, with the leaders saying that critical tasks had still not been completed. These included issues related to security arrangements, governance, and the integration of fighting forces. But as this stalemate continues, internally displaced persons remain sheltered in UN compounds across the country, fearing for their safety due to ongoing instability outside of the camps. CGTN's Patrick Oyet brings us more.
These people have lived in this camp in Malakal since 2013, 5 years after civil war broke out in South Sudan. Many here say they will only return home if lasting peace returns. Despite a peace deal being signed a year ago, many of those displaced remain in the camps.
Let the politicians agree. Let them implement what is written, what they have signed. The issue of security sector reforms in a number of states should be resolved. We as displaced people, we cannot go out of this camp. We fear that we will be killed.
We're supposed to be in our homes, but where can we go now? We're waiting for security to improve to allow us to go home. We're suffering here. We don't have enough food, but we're alive.
Many here believe a delay in forming a unity government could provide an opportunity for the former warring parties to resolve outstanding issues. South Sudan's government says it is doing all it can to bring lasting peace to the country.
This is the beginning. It should be the beginning for the best for the people of South Sudan. And I would tend to believe also that, we have crossed a long distance searching for peace.
The new government, which was scheduled to be formed this week, is now due to come together in February next year. However, for the unity government to be established, security reforms first need to be agreed and implemented, something that could still take some time. Patrick Oyet, CGTN, Juba, South Sudan.
The Kenya now, where over 6,000 delegates from 160 countries assembled in Nairobi as the International Conference on Population and Development Summit kicked off. Leaders are taking stock of the progress made as well as the areas where more effort is required. CGTN's Wilke Sanyaba reports.
25 years after the first International Conference on Population and Development was held, a section of world leaders and stakeholders assembled yet again, this time in Nairobi, to take stock of the progress. The three-day conference is dubbed ICPD 25. In 1994, in Cairo, Egypt, 179 governments made a declaration to work towards zero maternal deaths, zero cases of gender violence, and zero harmful practices against girls. This in recognition of the fact that the success of these goals is tied to the development goals of different countries.
Today, we stand united to declare the time to act is now. Never lose sight of who it is that we're fighting for. Anyone excluded, neglected, abused, forgotten.
We cannot return to a time when women had little say in reproductive issues, or for that matter, in any area of their lives. I think we can all agree that ICPD was a turning point, a defining moment in our history.
The conference, co-convened by Kenya and Denmark and hosted by the UNFPA, creating a platform to celebrate the gains made this far. But several hurdles still stand in the way of the rise of women and girls. 1 in 5 women continues to experience gender-based violence. 800 women and girls die every day during pregnancy and childbirth, and every year 4 million girls endure the painful effects of FGM.
We need to accelerate the promise of Cairo in order to build sustainable, vibrant, and inclusive societies. But if we fail to deliver on the Cairo promise, we risk consigning our children to a less secure future than we inherited.
The United Nations Population Fund estimates that it will cost $264 billion towards safeguarding women and girls and their rights. Already, Kenya, Uganda, Tanzania, Somalia and Ethiopia have signed an agreement to address cross-border FGM. Delegates will also make a Nairobi declaration as the world works to keep the Cairo promise. Bulkisanyabwa, CGTN.
The Eritrean capital, Asmara, is a UNESCO-registered World Heritage City. CGTN's Giram Chala got a special tour there, courtesy of a longtime resident.
Hi, my name is Paulo Solomon. I'm a native of Eritrea. We are in the main avenue, the Haranet Avenue. We are in front of the cathedral that was built in the 1930s. Also, this avenue, in the old days, back in the 50s, it had more traffic lights than Rome. The Italians called it a little Rome, but I think we have, in a smaller area, I think we have more Art Deco and emphasis in the heritage buildings and structures. This is where the Eritreans take their stroll in the evenings. In the daytime, as you see, across the cathedral, all the businesses, variety of businesses exist. This is the pride and joy of our city. This is Fiataliero. It's a landmark. It was built in the 1930s by a famous Italian architect. Anyway, it has been recognized as part of UNESCO as a heritage. And it looks like a plane. It's an Art Deco. This was built in order to serve a service station. But it looks, they have kept it as a landmark. They're not going to put anything else underneath in order to preserve it. This is Alexander Pushkin. His grandfather was taken from here, a few kilometers from Asmara, a place called Lagwain. He was taken to Turkey, to make it short, and then the Turkish Tsar gave it to a Russian Tsar in Pittsburgh. So this is the grandchild, Alexander Pushkin. Literally, he is the Shakespeare of Russia. With dignitaries from Russia and dignitaries from Eritrea, this statue was set in 2009. This is called Cinema Croce Rossa, which it means Red Cross Cinema. It was very affordable. This also was built in the 1930s. As kids, we started going to the movies here for 50 cents, Ethiopian cents. So anyone could afford to go, and they were giving shows from 12 noon to about 10 o'clock in the evening.
Well, it's time now for us to take a short break and return. The news making headlines in the world of business. Here's what you can expect. eSwatini joins Zimbabwe in banning meat from South Africa over foot and mouth disease. And Zimbabwe has new currency notes, but very little is available to spend.
Africa is the nexus of enterprise, and global business will tell you why it matters.
From the mega investment projects to multi-billion-dollar mergers and acquisitions.
Africa today collects, just in terms of revenues from taxes alone, $545 billion a year. If you take 10% of that and you devote it to the energy sector, problem solved.
All this on Global Business, weekdays at this time on CGTN.
Africa Live. Find your voice.
Welcome back. You're watching Africa Live, your business news. Well, eSwatini has suspended meat imports from South Africa following another outbreak of foot and mouth disease. This is the second time the country has stopped meat from its southern neighbor. Botswana and Zimbabwe have done the same. eSwatini is expected to only lift the ban once the highly contagious viral disease is eradicated. South Africa has confirmed the outbreak in Limpopo province and has placed one farm under quarantine to prevent the spread of the disease. According to data reports, South Africa's live animal exports to eSwatini totaled $31 million between January and September. While Zimbabwe's introduction of new 2 and 5 Zimbabwe dollar notes was touted as a positive move to ease the country's liquidity crunch, it has actually done very little. CGTN's Farai Mokatuya has been keeping a close eye on the issue and now brings us this report from Harare.
They look exactly the same. The only difference, removal of the word bond note, confirmation that Zimbabwe has its own fully fledged currency. The notes began circulating Tuesday, but some are yet to lay their hands on them.
Only a few people withdrew cash, then the ATM machine broke down. We have been waiting for 2 hours now.
Withdrawals are limited to a contentious $300 per week.
With prices going up, that won't buy much. They should allow us to withdraw as much as we need so that we don't keep coming back.
The central bank has tried to allay fears that the new notes will fuel inflation by explaining that they'll be swapped for existing electronic bank balances. Furthermore, it says they will be drip-fed into the market. There are worries that once withdrawn, the money may not return to the banks.
There are other people who are living on trading in currencies. They trade with the bond notes, the Zim dollar, the rand, the US dollar, because they don't have jobs. So as long as we have a lot of people on the streets that are making money out of these currencies and the currency shortages, then we're not going anywhere.
The new currency was introduced by Finance Minister Professor Mthuli Ncube to stabilize the economy. On Thursday, he hopes to present a growth-triggering 2020 budget. But because of missed targets from the previous one, not everyone shares his optimism.
He set some targets, which were very clear. That by the end of this year, 2019 December, inflation should be 5%, annual inflation. Economic growth measured by increase in GDP, 3.1% positive. So what has happened? Inflation is above 500% now, more than 100 times the target of the minister. Economic growth is now expected by government to be 6.9% negative.
Foreign currency shortages, a severe drought and cyclone devastation have combined to plunge Zimbabwe into its worst economic crisis since 2008. Farai Mokatuya, CGTN, Harare, Zimbabwe.
Well, finding the right partners is a challenge in any business endeavor, and for banks looking to invest in rail infrastructure, it's especially difficult. Not so for the Africa Export-Import Bank and Thelo DB. They have signed a memorandum of understanding at the African Investment Forum in South Africa that they say will change the country's railway sector. CGTN's Angela Coppola has more.
The key problem facing railway network developers is finding solid research on the state of the continent's rail infrastructure and other logistics. Research that identifies a gap and provides a range of solutions.
It's not just to build a railway, it's not just to get the rolling stock, but we need to operate them efficiently. Again, this partnership provides a solution for operating and managing complex issues that surround rail.
Partnership with Afrexim Bank allows us to mobilize capital not only from the continent of Africa, from development finance institutions and commercial banks on the continent, but to mobilize capital much more broadly.
The MOU goes further than research and rolling stock, though. It's about being multimodal, but there are practical considerations when it comes to rail.
I think on the continent we have to start thinking about standardizing gauge. But the reality today is let's get goods moving from A to B.
We believe that it will help us drive our effort in developing and expanding the logistics infrastructure that will help us expand intra-African trade in the years ahead.
The expectation is that the African Continental Free Trade Area will actually increase intra-African trade significantly, some say by as much as 15%. But for that to become a reality, the continent's transportation systems need to be integrated and, more importantly, seamless. I'm Angelo Coppola for CGTN in Sandton, South Africa.
Sudan needs up to $5 billion in budget support to avert an economic collapse. That's according to the country's finance ministry. At the moment, Sudan's new government is looking to build a youth-focused economy through fundamental reforms. However, as CGTN's Daniel Arap Moy now reports, that plan seems far from realistic.
An economy deep in distress, Sudan is eyeing to start a new course. But at what cost? According to the country's finance ministry, the Horn of Africa nation needs up to $5 billion in budget support to avert a looming economic collapse.
The budget support, I think, for example, some estimates ranges between 3 to 4, maybe even 5 billion. Once we get the budget process going and we align the numbers and do the right the calculations, I think we should be able in a better position to do it.
Where more than half of Sudan's current 44 million people live in poverty. Late last year, months of demonstrations over cash shortages and price hikes triggered an uprising against then leader Omar al-Bashir. Fast forward after his ouster, Sudan is yet to recover. The state has in recent months been getting by on aid from Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates.
I expected that once the people took to the streets and the youth took to the streets, that things would change. But the situation is worse. People are standing in line for bread, to eat lunch, and they cannot find any.
There is big pressure. Market prices are insanely high. We're working here and it's not enough. You have to work 2 or 3 days in order to support yourself.
Sudan's current civilian government has taken over for 3 years under a power-sharing deal with the military. It has so far drawn slightly more than half of $3 billion in support. But despite that, the new government says it has foreign currency reserves to fund imports for only a few weeks.
The central bank has no option but to print money to buy gold. This cycle has to be broken, and we will do it soon. Basically, what we plan to do, as I told you, that we wanted to retain all these purchasing activities to the Ministry of Finance through real resources. And that's why we need support. You know, we will do our part, but we cannot do it alone. For this government to succeed, for this revolution to proceed into stable democracy in this very critical part of Africa and the Middle East, we need understanding and support, and I'm quite certain we will get it.
As Sudan's new government moves forward to build a youth-focused economy, all that now remains for these citizens is hope for an improved economy. Daniel Arap Moy, CGTN.
The Egyptian government has begun procedures to release a number of its military companies into the stock market. It's not yet known which companies will be sold. The aim is to reinvigorate the Egyptian stock market that has been seen a slowdown in the last 2 years. Yasser Hakim has more.
Few people saw it coming. The announcement that looked well calculated.
The IPOs that the government is readying to be released into the stock market must include military companies. Military companies have to go into the stock exchange. This will open the door for Egyptians to own stakes in entities that I believe are going to be successful.
Aside from arms, military-owned companies cover a dozen sectors. It includes chemicals, vehicles, agriculture, electrical equipment, and more. According to official numbers, these companies have seen a 5-fold profit increase in the last 4 years. But why sell now?
The military companies are known for being better managed than its competitors in the private sector. The military IPOs will attract local and foreign investors. Its success will also encourage the government to sell its state-owned companies and banks that have been postponed several times.
Experts say these companies will need some restructuring before being released in the market.
It has to go through restructuring in a way that allows it to merge within the market and become independent and transparent, to conform with the rules and regulations of the stock market. We still don't know how the government will go about it.
Analysts believe an IPO will not happen before the first quarter of 2020. The idea of an IPO for military companies has been welcomed by most stockbrokers. Being profitable institutions, they can give a major boost to the recession-hit stock exchange market in Egypt. Yes, Hakim for CGTN, Cairo.
Time for us to take a short break. When we return, here's what you can expect. The 5th installation of the Huma Sekela Festival pays special tribute to his legacy.
Join us in global business and see Africa through our eyes. The greatest journeys, the greatest sights, the greatest adventures.
Here in Qanater, this weir allows the locals to walk on water.
We're far more than just TV news. We're your passport to the wonders of Africa.
To bring you stories of struggle, survival and hope.
So let's explore